Hi, my name is Kendall Cahan, and in this video you'll get to see how I turned this little cherry box. I did this video in real time so you could see my workflow, and hopefully you enjoy that. I know it's a long video, but I think it helps to see things in real time. So I started the project off by just creating a tenon on the bottom of each piece. This tenon is going on the lid so that I can reverse it in the chuck and get a better hold on it. And then when I start working on the base, I'll actually completely finish the bottom before I flip it around. Okay, so that was the tenon done on what will become the top of the box. And now I'm going to be working on the bottom, and I'll completely finish the bottom before I flip it around. And you'll see me use dividers to carefully mark the size of the foot. And that way when you flip the piece around, the chuck is the right size to grip that foot, and it won't leave any chuck marks. Or jaw marks, so when you take the piece out, you're done with it and you don't have to reverse it again to remove any marks. The important thing to remember when you are using dividers to mark anything on a spinning piece of wood is that you only want to be touching the dividers on the left point. You do not want both points to be in contact at the same time. Otherwise, the wood will rip the dividers out of your hand and it can be pretty dangerous. And here I am just making sure that the underside of the foot is slightly concave. That way, when you set the box down, it's only resting on the perimeter of the foot. So here I'm going to just use the left wing of the gouge to make some light shearing cuts to just blend that curve in nicely. But you can hear by the sound the tool's making that the tool rest was a little bit too far away from the workpiece. I should have moved it in slightly more to reduce the vibration. And I'm going to use a spindle gouge, a 3/8 inch spindle gouge, to just make that corner nice and crisp for the jaws to register against. And then I'm going to add a little bit of detail to the bottom of the foot. So now the bottom of the box is ready for sanding, and I'll just start with 180 grit. I've got a really clean surface off the tools, and it really pays to get the best finish you can straight off the tool so you can save money on abrasives. So this is 180, and then I'll move on to 220. Okay, so that looks really good off of the 180 grit, and I'll go ahead and start sanding with 220. And I'll fold the abrasive into thirds, and that just helps kind of absorb some of the heat that you create while you're sanding. And it also makes some nice corners on the paper so that you can get it into the nice details that you've made. Okay, and for the finish, I'm going to be using beeswax and walnut oil. So I apply the beeswax first, and then I use just a old t-shirt that's got it's loaded up with walnut oil, and I just press that into the surface with the piece spinning, and that just melts the beeswax and the oil together into the surface. And then I'll wipe off the excess with a cleaner rag. Okay, so now that I've got the bottom reversed, I can go ahead and start shaping the outside before I start to hollow the piece. And even though the foot is the correct size for the chuck, I still want to make my passes here fairly light, because even if the foot is the correct size, if you're super aggressive with the tools, it can sometimes cause a lot of vibration and cause those teeth to dig in some. Okay, so there I was just blending in that transition point where that little angle is between the bottom and the side, and then I'll take one final pass, trying to get it as clean as possible so that I can sand again with 180. And now that I have the sides the way that I want them, I'll just true up that top again, and then I'll hold the block up that's going to become the lid of the box, and just get an idea of if I need to bring those sides in anymore so that I get the kind of proportions right. So I'm going to start hollowing the box out with a bowl gouge, and then once I can't really get around that corner anymore, I'll switch to using scrapers to get the corner nice and sharp and flatten out the bottom. Here I'm just using a 1-inch scraper to get a little bit more depth and also get that corner nice and crisp. And even though this is a square end scraper, it does have a very slight curve to it. That way both of the corners of the scraper can't dig in at the same time. So I'm only using about half of the width of the tool at once. So once I have the depth where I think it should be, I'll just check it with a ruler. And I do that by just sticking the ruler down to the bottom, moving my thumb up to where it meets the rim, and then I transfer that to the outside, and that way I can see what my depth looks like. And then I'm going to take one final very light pass with a 3/8 spindle gouge down the sides of the box on the inside. That way I get a really nice clean surface, and also because the spindle gouge has a nice fingernail grind on it, it'll get right into that corner without damaging the bottom. Here I'm just using a skew chisel flat on its side, just to make sure that corner is nice and crisp. And I got a really good finish right off the tool, so I'll just go ahead and start sanding with 180 again, and then I'll move on to 220. And once again, I'll just go ahead and put the beeswax on the inside and then blend that in with walnut oil. Okay, so that is the bottom of the box done. And again, since the foot is the right size for the jaws, there's no chuck marks and it's a finished piece. I can go ahead and start working on the lid now. Okay, so like the bottom, I'll begin hollowing with a 1/2 inch bowl gouge before moving on to some other tools. Okay, so now I just need to make sure I have enough room so that I can create the small ledge or lip on the underside of the lid that will register the top to the base. So I'll just use dividers to do this. I just measured the inside of the bottom and then transferred that mark onto the lid. And I'm just going to use some peeling cuts here with a spindle gouge to create that small lip there. And I'll just round it over a little bit so that it doesn't have any sharp corners. So here I'm just adjusting the fit, and I want to make sure that since this is a cross-grain box that I leave just enough room that this lid is not tight on the base. As the seasons change, the wood will expand and contract with the humidity. So when you're making a cross-grain box, you really need to make sure that you don't have like a suction fit lid or a pop fit lid. It really needs to have just a tiniest bit of wiggle room for the wood to do its thing. So I'm going to use the 1-inch square end scraper again, just to add just a little bit more depth to the ledge there. You want to make sure that it has a nice positive registration with the bottom. So once again, I'll use some dividers to mark the size for the recess that I want to expand my jaws into. And the measurement's not super critical, it just needs to be slightly wider than the jaws are when they're completely closed. So here I'm just using a round nose scraper to refine the curve on the inside. And then after that, I can begin sanding. Okay, so once again, I'll start sanding with 180, and I'll use the very corner of the abrasive just to get into that little groove that I created for the jaws to expand into. And you really want to make sure that you get a nice clean surface there so that you don't have to sand it too much. If you sand it too much, you can kind of create a curve instead of a sharp corner, and the jaws won't register properly up against it. Okay, so with the underside of the lid finished, I can swap my chuck jaws out back to the pin jaws, and that way I can reverse the piece and I can start shaping the outside. Okay, so just like earlier, I am going to take some really nice and light cuts here. I don't want to jolt this off of the lathe because the hold is good enough for what I'm doing here, but I don't want to be aggressive with it. So here I'm just reducing the diameter slightly so that it looks a little bit more proportional with the base. And I'm just doing that with some really gentle shearing cuts. Okay, so here I am just checking the fit again, and I'm also kind of working on the top in stages so that I don't remove too much and then end up having to start over. The nice thing about expanding the jaws into the lid this way is that it runs pretty much true no matter how many times you take it on and off the lathe, so it really pays here just to take it off a few times in between making your cuts so you can make sure you're getting the design that you want. So here I'm just marking a line on top of the lid where I want to project the curve from the base of the box into the top. So it's really nice to have a little detail there where the line would be projected through. It just makes the design look a little bit better. So here I'm just creating a little button on the top of the lid, and then I'm going to stop this cut right on my line that I created. And here I'm just using the 1/2-inch bowl gouge again to create a little bit of a reverse curve around the edge of the lid, and that kind of makes the whole thing sort of an OG shape. So there I'm just using the 3/8 spindle gouge again to just kind of round over that little button on the top. And that just makes it look like a nice little bead sitting on the top. And also with a box of this size, you don't need a handle on the lid because you can reach your hand over the whole top. Okay, so here I'm just reducing the height slightly. I decided that the top looked a little bit too tall for the base, so I'm just bringing that all down again. And here I'm just using a 1/2-inch skew chisel flat on the tool rest to use as a negative scraper. And this piece is so small that I needed to go down to a 1/2-inch skew in order to fit between the button on the top and the detail that I've created there before the reverse curve. Okay, so again, I'll start off with 180 and then move to 220, and then I'll apply the beeswax and walnut oil. Okay, so once again, I'm just wiping off the excess oil and wax with a cleaner rag, and then that will be the top finished. And here's the finished piece. So if you made it this far, thank you very much for watching, and happy turning.